Everybody that I have talked to, from all of the remote viewers that I have interviewed, and I believe that of the government program, those who speak publicly, I have interviewed all, to astronauts, to everybody that you talk to. When the name Ingo Swann is mentioned, usually it's followed by the greatest natural psychic ever born, a natural psychic. He is the great-grandfather, or the father of, depending on how he wants it promoted, of remote viewing, the program that ran for 20 years with the U.S. government. We shockingly found out one night on Ted Koppel. That was shocking, wasn't it? And then, of course, many of those members of the military remote viewing program went into the private sector. What can I tell you about Ingo? An awful lot, too much. 55 to 58, enlisted in the U.S. Army, served in Korea, was Secretary and Aide on the staff of General I.D. White, then Commander-in-Chief of all forces in the Pacific. Up through 1969, employed under permanent contract, get this, at the Secretariat of the United Nations, New York, holding several clerical and administrative positions. 1972, 58 to 72, undertook research projects of personal interest, particularly the occult, parapsychological fields, astrology, numerology, auras. It goes on and on and on and on. Just every field that we talk about on this program. There are 3 pages of this. His work in parapsychological laboratories. It really goes on and on and on, and I would never in a million years have enough time to tell you about everything Ingo Swann has done. In 1989, he retired from active research and public appearances, so this is fairly rare, what we're going to get to do tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, from Manhattan, I suspect, New York anyway, here's Ingo Swann. Ingo.
Hello.
Hello there. It is such an honor to talk to you.
Well, I never know how to respond to that, but it's an honor to talk to you, too.
I have spoken, of course, with so many of your students. Would that be the way to put it?
Well, former students, I guess.
Disciples?
No, I don't encourage that at all.
Take me back in your life, Ingo. What I said at the beginning about the other remote viewers I've had on, even astronauts, people who would mention your name, have billed you as, in their opinion, the greatest natural psychic born.
Well, people say things, and I don't think I'm the greatest natural psychic born, but, people are people, and they say things, and then this rumor gets going, and so forth and so on. I don't even like to be called a psychic to begin with, and earlier on in my career, I tried my best to...
Intuitive?
I've always been interested in perception and expanding perception, so I'd like to be called a perception researcher, but, in common parlance, you have just 1 or 2 categories that you can put people in, and the psychic one fitted.
Let me put it this way. The gentlemen who were in the military remote viewing program maintained to the person that virtually almost anybody could be trained to do remote viewing, but they put you in a different category from those people in the sense that you had the greatest natural walk-in ability they ever observed. Is that fair?
Well, perhaps.
Perhaps, huh?
I mean, I've seen other people that have great abilities, too, so... anyhow, there it is. What can I do about it? I think that I don't really see why I should be singled out for that kind of type of thing, because nobody ever gets anything done by themselves, so you have to work with people, and there have been other great psychics that really impressed me, like the famous Harold Sherman, who's now gone, of course, and even Hella Hammond, who worked with us in California. So maybe I'm one among a few, but I'm certainly, well, anyhow, can we move beyond this?
We can by asking, since they call you, would you be the father or the great-grandfather of remote viewing? Which would be fair?
I think Dr. Harold Puthoff, deserves that title, because without him and his wonderful talents, their remote viewing would never have seen the light of day. It was he who had all of the contacts in Washington and in the military, and it was he who had the patience with people, including me, and also the diplomacy to negotiate all of the egos that get in the way of getting anything done, And I will say absolutely that without his interest, his long-term interest in it, that this remote viewing would never have seen the light of day.
How did Hal Puthoff get on to you?
I'm sorry, I'm choking up on this because I admire Puthoff so much, Earlier on, when I was working here in New York with Cleve Baxter, I'm sure you've heard of him.
Of course.
The plant guy.
Yes, of course.
We were talking about the speed that these perceptions take place with. They're really fast most of the time. And so I was saying, who understands this kind of thing? And so he mentioned Dr. Harold Puthoff, whom I'd never heard of, who was a physicist interested in tachyon theories. So I eventually wrote him a letter, and he called up right away and was interested because he had made a proposal to find new ways of looking at information transference amongst people and things, and it just turned out that my letter sort of fell into that category. So that's how this began, and he was working at SRI, that Stanford Research Institute.
Stanford. Mm-hmm.
Eventually invited me out there to talk and what we call play around, and that's how we came together.
Was he connected with the government?
Well, Stanford Research Institute was at that time called the nation's second largest think tank. And the scientists there actually, SRI itself didn't really fund much research, but it invited top-notch researchers in and gave them rooms and typewriters to work with and things like that. But they had to go out and get their own money and their own projects. So Puthoff was trying to get people interested in the properties of mind, to develop it beyond static potentials, and so forth and so on. And so he's the one who had the contacts in Washington and things, and eventually attracted attention to remote viewing.
So somebody finally came and knocked on the door from the government and said, this is interesting, we'd like to explore the possibilities of some sort of program for intelligence gathering purposes, something like that?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. People forget now that back then there was a Cold War going on, and these guys that came knocking at the door had, much to their embarrassment, found out that the Soviet Union was conducting research in these areas, which took everybody by surprise, because you have to remember back in 1972 that the conventional scientific systems of the world did not believe in this. And so this was a big shock. So they were actually jumping around trying to find somebody who could educate them on these matters.
So in other words, you've got to keep up with the Ivanovs.
Well, you had to find out something about what they were doing.
Sure.
And it just happened that the experiments I'd worked with Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler and Cleve Baxter had made sort of headlines back at that time, and Puthoff had the access to the Washingtonians, so it just all fell together, much to my surprise.
At that point, what were you able to demonstrate for Hal Puthoff? When he studied you, or when you allowed yourself to be studied, What conclusions did they come to?
The mandate at that time was to find any ability that could be replicated. That means reproduced time and again in a laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
This is the one thing that was missing from historical parapsychology. And in New York, I had worked with Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler on PK, that's psychokinesis, and with Cleve Baxter on PK. So when Hal invited me to Stanford, we fiddled around with PK.
How so?
Well, we did things in the laboratory and things, standard things. But he managed to, the problem of PK was, of course, you had to show that the person doing the PK was completely shielded from the target.
Mm-hmm.
If there was any way that there could be any influencing, underhand trick or anything, then that is something that needed to be considered. So he managed to get the quark detector at Stanford University available.
The what detector?
Well, it was an instrument at that time that was designed to try to detect quarks, which were
quarks.
Some kind of cosmic particle that goes through everything, So the quark detector at Stanford University was buried in cement and aluminum casing in the floor. And so there was no way that you could say that the perpetrator of the PK could have had any contact with the machinery down there.
Of course, the quark detector by its nature, because quarks are still, I think, almost undetectable, or they're still searching for quarks, aren't they?
No, I think they found them.
They think they found them.
Since then.
But nevertheless, this instrument would be highly, highly sensitive, obviously.
Well, I walked into the place and I said, well, where's the detector? I wasn't told anything, And so they looked at me. There were about 9 people there, and they said, you're standing on it. And I would look down at this cement floor and everything. And so I said, well, gosh. So I drew it. I used my visualization and everything. And I said, well, I have to try and locate it down there somehow. So I did my little magic on locating it, and I started drawing it. And when I was in process of drawing it, it stopped dead in its tracks.
It stopped.
Yeah.
It stopped.
Yes, this had been running, and it was a nice sine wave going up and down. It had been running for, months and months and months.
So then, if I have this straight, the drawing of it would be what we perceive as remote viewing. The stopping of it would be what is psychokinesis, the ability to affect something.
Well, I didn't mean to stop it. It just stopped. It just was somehow these, if you can say it, my brain waves interacted with this mechanism down there.
Yes.
And it stopped. It went up, it broke its sine wave, and it wandered around for a while, and you could see 9 faces turn pale right around me, And one guy who I think was a doctoral student turned around and started to rush out of the room and bumped into a post and nearly knocked himself out. And so I was sitting there, and, I said, well, what happened? What happened? I didn't even know what happened at that time, but then they said, oh, can you do this again? I said, well, I don't know what I did in the first place. So anyhow, I continued drawing, and then it did it again. It stopped again, but not as dramatically as the first time. And that impressed everybody right across the nation, because if the mind can do that to a quark detector, hypothetically speaking, it could also do it to a missile or an atomic bomb. And so this immediately, within 1 week, Puthoff had plane loads of people coming out to talk to him.
Oh, my.
That's how it got started.
Was, at what point can you say, at what point the U.S. government began to get interested with taxpayer money?
At that point.
At that point.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I can well imagine. Were you?
Well, the evidence coming out of the Soviet Union was quite dramatic. The part of the evidence said that they were trying to train people to knock out other people mentally at a distance. And so this kind of thing gave substance to to that, meaning that could be possible, you know. So,
Is that possible, Ingo?
I think so at some point, but I would prefer to talk. That would have to be talked about in you know, how people telepathically interact to begin with, which they do. So that's a big, larger picture. But back then, people were only interested in hardware. They weren't interested in mind. But if something happened to the hardware, then they had to take an interest. And later on, it turned out that they could be educated to accept the fact that mind is just as important as the hardware. So it was the hardware, the quark detector thing, that Hal reminded me that we went back and did it another time, about a week after, but with results that weren't as impressive as the first time, and I've completely forgotten about that second trip.
You're not going to believe this, but behind our conversation right now, I'm hearing another conversation, Ingo.
I thought that was your radio.
No. That's some other completely separate conversation going on. You're hearing it as well?
Yes. Weekly. It's best.
That's really weird.
That's an advertisement going on.
That's really weird. That's really weird, Ingo. Listen, hold on. I'm going to I'm going to stop at the break, which we're at now, and I'm going to redial the phone line and see if we can get rid of that or find it and kill it.
Shall I hang up?
No. Yeah, hang up. I'll call you right back.
Okay.
All right. Ingo Swann, the father of remote viewing and so much more to say, is my guest. A rare opportunity. He'll be right back. All right, let's see if I've got this right. First of all, let's see if we've got a connection. Ingo?
Yes, sir.
We were talking about the early psychokinesis experiments, and I have talked with remote viewers about the possibility of remote influencing.
Yep.
They the same thing?
Yeah, it would be.
It would be. Some remote viewers, well, first of all, when you talk to them, they seem hesitant to talk about that subject at all. Some say they don't think it's possible that, for example, you could do a negative thing. For example, Saddam Hussein, that we could burst a blood vessel in his head, you know, something of that sort. They say, well, you couldn't do anything like that. Could you?
Well, I suspect if the proper people knew how to do it, it would have already been done. And the fact that it hasn't been done means they don't know how to do it. Something like that. But the evidence in laboratory work that people can influence plants and mechanisms is at a small level. I mean, nothing really big. But at a small level, that's incontrovertible, that kind of evidence. So potentially it's possible to be developed.
Well, I have personally experienced random number generators in recent work, and I've done it myself, experimented endlessly with spectacular, unbelievable results.
Yeah.
You know the software I'm talking about, I imagine.
Sure. There are lots of versions of it.
It's just astounding. It's astounding, and it seems as though, to varying degrees, almost anybody can seem to do it.
Well, I might not go that far, but certainly enough people have demonstrated something along those lines. But the way it works is not understood, so people use the model of the material universe as their working model, and it doesn't quite follow the standard laws of the material universe. It's more of a mental thing, and people just don't know or don't admit that there are laws of the mental universe too, which are somewhat different from the physical universe.
Well, then let me revise that, and let me say I was sent the software. I have the software here.
Uh-huh.
And it, maybe you're familiar with this particular version, it presents you with two pictures, one which is perhaps all white noise on the screen, and the other a picture of a castle or, whatever. and you sit there, and it's clocking you. It's a certain amount of time, and you're trying to make the white noise turn completely into the picture of the castle. And then it will, at the end of that time, assign a percentage of effect that you had during that period. Now, I tried it myself time and time again, and I would consistently score 85, 95% while I was sitting there. Then I would try it and just walk out of the room, walk outside, do something else for a while, come back, inevitably 20, 30% when I'm not there. 80, 90% when I'm there concentrating. Now, that just took the breath away.
Yeah, well, it should. I mean, I don't know what the equipment was measuring, but if you build up, let's say, descriptively, if you build up a mental charge that's eventually becomes big enough to overwhelm what's going on in the physical universe, then what's going on in the physical universe has to change accordingly. So it was probably randomly presenting some kind of white noise type of thing, and the more you interacted with it, the more it became organized, and then if that was what was being measured, then it turned into the picture.
Precisely. The software
like
is called
switch.
It's called Shape Changer,
right,
from Pear Inc., which came from...
Oh, yes, those guys. Oh,
yes, those guys.
Those wonderful people.
Yes. And it's stunning. I mean, it absolutely is almost scary. At least that was my experience with it. So that's psychokinesis. You are affecting a random number generator to be not so random.
Well, it's called psychokinesis if the random number generator is actually a physical type of thing. But when it's called telepathy if it's another mind involved. But the principles behind it must be somewhat similar. Behind either one of them must be somewhat similar.
Well, then, in your opinion, is there a way to take this limited ability that can be demonstrated, as we just discussed, and expand it? Is there a way to nurture it and strengthen it?
Well, there's the old adage that practice makes perfect. But in fact, I don't know of any experiments that have gotten this thing together so that it could be considered as a threat thing. It goes on in labs all the time, but when people would be, for instance, assigned to try to burst a blood vessel in somebody's head, then it doesn't quite work that way. There are other things that apparently interfere with it.
That's what I've heard. Now, what does that suggest about the nature of the universe?
Well, it suggests that we don't know enough about it. And in fact, the nature of the universe, what is known in the conventional sciences as the nature of the universe, is in fact only the physical part of it, not the other part. I mean, life can't really be explained completely by matter because, as it used to be thought, because matter, it's now known that matter is just a congregated form of energy to begin with. So there's a big field out there called energetics, which people don't really know too much about. Dr. Bill Tiller is one of the people that works with this kind of thing, and of course he finds it very hard to sell his book. Yes, if these abilities, if you want to call them that, get to the point where they get to be strong enough that they could be interpreted as a threat value, then that becomes a different matter entirely.
You're not going to believe this. I'm hearing again some other broadcast or discussion underway way behind us. Really weird, Ingo.
Well, somebody's eavesdropping on this and using a frequency that's quite near that radio station, so it's bleeding back into your system.
Well, that just doesn't happen, at least not normally. Not here, believe me. All right, well, how did you feel about the development of the specific discipline of remote viewing that the government did?
Well, Puthoff did it. The government didn't do it. Puthoff did it for the government.
But he did it based on studying you to a large degree.
Yes, that's true.
So, but see, that's what I don't understand. You're a natural at this. How did he translate your apparent natural ability to a discipline that could be developed into a program?
Well, this is a long story, but basically...
It's a long radio program.
I have to say something now that probably a lot of people would be irritated with, but we did. You see, you have to consider the realities of the clients, in this case, the government agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to consider actually what it is that you think you're working with. And so what Puthoff and I did was decide that whatever psychic perceptions consisted of, that they did consist of perception. So it didn't really matter if the source of it could be called psychic or not. The stuff to work with were the perceptual processes in the human being. Mm-hmm. So we converted over to perception studies rather than psychic studies. And there's an enormous, even at that time, there was an enormous literature about perception, and it was quite well understood scientifically that perception can be expanded by simply working with it. And in fact, when he and I put together our first proposals, we did it from the angle of perception because there were going to be oversight committees and all kinds of people inspecting this, and you had to show why one would be justified for looking into this kind of perception. So we used perceptual studies, and in fact, it turned out several years later that what we were doing was increasing perception, the parameters of perception, and so we just eliminated the word psychic from it, and so forth and so on.
Perception equals intuition?
Perception equals anything that you can perceive. And, of course, you don't even need to call it intuition. It's only intuition if it's not based upon physical types of things,
Well, is it for the regular person, the regular Joe walking down the street, every now and then fairly intuitive people will have a very strong feeling about a decision that looms ahead in their life,
yeah.
An intuitive feeling. Is that what we're talking about?
That's a construct of processing information to the point where it becomes perceptible. If that person didn't have high stage perceptual factors working for him, then they wouldn't experience that kind of thing.
As opposed to logical deduction.
Right. Now, in considering perception, you have to understand that it can be closed down. There are all sorts of processes that can be used to limit a person's perceptual faculties. So if they can be closed down, such as in hypnosis and brainwashing and all kinds of social programming and things like that, these things can be reduced from their functioning. If they can be reduced from their functioning, they can also be expanded. And that was the principles that we went forward with, was perceptual studies.
In other words, how far could you take it?
Yeah.
Apparently far enough to get funding to go for 20 years now.
Yes.
We were all shocked.
You had to produce results, though, really fast, so it wasn't just merely hypothesis. You had to put your results where your mouth was eventually.
Well, you did that, right? Or it was done.
It was done, yes.
It was done. One thing that I have never understood, and to this very day do not, is that the remote viewing, when we saw Dead Koppel, it was to announce we had been doing it for 20 years, but guess what? We're not doing it anymore because it doesn't work. Well, 20 years is a hell of a long time to decide something doesn't work.
Oh, dear. Actually, when you think of the larger societal picture and the balance of powers and the secrecy that goes on with everything, would you want to have high-quality remote viewing admitted as workable?
No.
No. I was told behind the scenes as early as 1973 that even if I was told in secret or in confidentiality, that even if we did succeed at demonstrating something along these lines at Stanford, that eventually it would be obliterated because if something like that becomes good enough, then it's a threat potential against everybody's closely guarded secrets. And so, but at that time during the Cold War, you notice that the program was closed down almost immediately that the Cold War was over with.
That's right. Well,
okay.
Supposedly, yes.
Yes. So this kind of development wasn't needed anymore because the American effort was a response to the Soviet effort, and when the Soviet effort collapsed and went away, then there was no need for it anymore in America. So now a publicity program had to get going saying, yes, we looked at it, but it didn't work, and hoping that the 20-year period wasn't noticed.
Well, I ask every remote viewer the same question, and that is, if remote viewing really works, and they had to say it didn't work, then wouldn't it be logical to conclude that it's still going on, and probably even at a higher level, and almost every remote viewer says, no, politics killed it, and I just refuse to believe that. If it really works, then we're still doing it.
Well, if so, it's even when we were working on it, it was a black program.
Right.
And it was on, especially after it got classified, which I encouraged it to be at that time, just to protect the people working with the remote viewing. But if it's going on, then it's a black program, double black, triple black, I don't know.
But well, sure,
times
well,
black, so
one can imagine that easily.
Yep.
So you don't rule out the possibility that at some level it is still going on.
Oh, I don't rule it out at all, especially with regards to Japan and China. Yeah. Americans only respond to things. They very seldom take the initiative unless it involves money and territory. But interest in this is, I mean, a really big interest, big time interested in this. It's been going on in Japan and China for some time.
Well, the Chinese are not exactly, other than some trade, our best friends at the moment. So if they're doing it, I would think that...
well, let's say they're messing around with it, trying to figure out so forth and so on. In my website, I have reviewed a book written by somebody who's quite knowledgeable and all that. I don't have it handy here. But it's a report on the kind of research that's been going on in China along these lines since about the early 1980s. And this gives one pause if you're interested in the future. I mean, it's quite obvious that whoever develops these kind of things to a point where they become functional, really functional, are going to have an advantage over those that don't have that. That's quite clear.
Well, if that's quite clear...
well, it's clear to me and a number of other people that the best way to make people not be concerned is to say it doesn't work. You know, it's the same thing as like saying UFOs don't exist and ETs aren't real.
That's right.
And so, you know, you can put out this social conditioning out there that simply causes people not to think about it because it's thought to be insignificant even if it does exist. So if it becomes, the point when it changes from being insignificant to significant is the make-break point between what's going to happen about it.
Gotcha. Hold on, Ingo. We're at the top of the hour break. All right, once again, Ingo Swan. And Ingo, welcome back. We were discussing the possibility of a current program 2 or 3 black levels deep that would still be going on in this country. And you admitted it as at least a possibility. A mutual acquaintance of ours, John Alexander, you know him?
Oh, yes.
He called during the break, and he said, why don't you ask, I don't want to take credit for his question. He said, Art, why don't you ask Ingo if such a program, in his opinion, could be going on without him?
Oh, yes, absolutely. They don't want me around anymore.
Oh, no?
No. First of all, I'm too stubborn about a lot of things. And second of all, I have ideas of my own, and they don't want to deal with people who have ideas of their own. And I'm getting too old anyway. You know, I'm probably past my prime in all of this.
Well, let me ask you about a few of those things. What do you mean you're stubborn?
Huh?
I said, what do you mean you're stubborn? From their point of view, how so?
Well, you know, if you work in that system, those systems, these are chains of command.
Oh, sure.
And one of the things that we came to grief over was these chains of command sent down that we were supposed to research this and that. And I would say, well, there's no use doing that because it's not going to result in anything, and I refuse to do it. And
were these bureaucrats?
Oh, they were bureaucrats. They were military people. But, there's chains of command everywhere, and people that are putting up money like to get what they think should be done. But, I'm not going to sit around and waste my time just trying to fulfill a mandate like that when it's real to me that it's never going to get anywhere.
So in other words, put simply, a few times, you told them just to get screwed.
Well, I left SRI about 5 times.
Five times?
Over this issue. And I said, I'd really rather go back to New York and write a novel and try to earn some money or something, I'm an artist. I just as well take this time and paint.
Well, I once got fired by a boss 6 times. Yeah. So there you are. Ideas of your own. In other words, avenues of research that you wanted to pursue that they were not interested in. I would take it to mean that.
Well, it had to be one. You see, in the early 70s, the only frames of reference that most people had for these kind of things were drawn from science fiction. Nobody sat around and read boring parapsychology periodicals and things like that. So they had these science fiction ideas, and that's what they were thinking they were working with. And I says, well, we have to change that right away. Mm. In fact, I once gave a presentation in a place I don't even think I should mention here, and say you can't get anywhere if you're going to think of this in terms of science fiction. You have to think of it in terms of real phenomena, and real phenomena are acting differently from how these things are presented in science fiction. So,
did you scare the people you worked for?
Sure. I didn't set about to do that, but for instance, all through 1972 and 73, people would come from Washington to talk with Puthoff, but they wouldn't want to talk with me. They wouldn't even eat lunch with me because they were afraid I could read their minds. Could you? Well, sometimes. And I said, well, what can I do about this? So I had to eat lunch alone. I had to go to this little cheapo cafeteria while they sat in the dining room over there and talked about me.
Well, that's going to engender some resentment right there.
Well, I don't care. To hell with resentment, If there's going to be resentment, everybody's supposed to row the same boat on a project, right?
Sure.
And if they don't do that, I'm going to go watch the grass grow somewhere.
Well, remote viewing, for example, finding a weapon system in a foreign country,
yes,
that's one thing. Drawing it, perhaps locating it, but sitting down at lunch or any other venue with somebody and essentially reading their mind, that's...
Oh, these chains of command are just terrified of telepathy, and I review that situation in my book, Penetration, which it's just they're terrified of it. They don't want telepathy, and they're quite content to talk about it in a model of mind-to-mind thing that actually doesn't work. So if And it's irrational, you know. I mean, most minds aren't worth reading to begin with.
Well, but it's not really irrational. In every, excuse me, but science fiction movie I've seen in which telepathy was the subject, inevitably the telepaths were hunted down and killed like dogs.
Yes, human history has a history of doing just that.
Yeah, sure. Once we burned witches, but I really can understand why that would be the reaction of somebody who would be terrified that you would be reading their inner thoughts. I mean, that is a terrifying thing for most people.
It's not just their inner thoughts; it's their secrets.
Their secrets.
Their secrets, you know, and it's just one of the realities out there as to why these. You see, the whole field of psychoenergetics has never been really researched, because if you permit research into it, and if you give funding for it, our program at SRI was called psychoenergetics, because it was an energetics, studying the energetics of information transfer between things and people, and so forth and so on. And people were so afraid of telepathy, I said to put off, well, we can't use this word anymore, because, I mean, that's like waving a red flag before a bull. So we eliminated the word telepathy and a few other words too. But yes, I mean, if telepathy could be made functional, then everybody on this planet has a problem. And if it can be made functional between Earthlings and extraterrestrials, then you can. This is, this is upsetting the entire Earth frame cultures.
Are you a natural telepath?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, yes, you do.
I don't really. I think that, another book that I had to self-publish called Psychic Sexuality. I mean, people pick up sex vibes like mad from each other. And this has never been researched, because it opens the door to the greater realm of psychoenergetics, And it's just, no, I mean, as long as there are secrets and preferred information and a power structure that where the power is collected at the top and not distributed very fairly down throughout the rest of it. Yeah. These power structures don't want this, because power is has enough problems. If you introduce telepathy into it, then it really becomes problematic.
Oh yeah. The whole structure is supported by secrets.
Yep.
So we couldn't have an end to secrets, at least not and survive it. Secrets, deceit, and lies. The world is.
No, we could have secrets, but it simply means that they become accessible and could be used for proprietary access to formulas and places and what people are actually doing. What people are actually doing at the top of these power structures has nothing to do with what the other people down below think is going on.
Do you still have to eat lunch alone a lot now?
Well, what was John Alexander's question again?
Well, it was, could they really have a double or triple black secret program without you?
Sure. I mean, they had them before me. They can have them after me, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Posting go.
So then, we should imagine it's certainly possible they have something going, and if they don't, then they're not paying proper, careful attention to national security.
That's right. Absolutely.
Now, why won't any of the other remote viewers say that? I mean, inevitably, almost to the one, they say, oh, no, there's no program going on now. Politics killed it. It was an embarrassment, all the rest of it. It's dead. I guarantee you there's nothing going on now. That's what they say. Do they lack imagination?
Well, as you know, I don't like to talk about other people.
Well, this is a general thing.
This is an issue, right?
Well, it is, yes.
People interpret reality from with their personal frames of reference. And if they don't have frames of reference, that can incorporate this kind of thing, then that's how they function, you know. And if, for instance, you know, if they use the parapsychology frame of reference to try to understand these things, this is the wrong frame of reference. You have to use frames of reference that involve perception and receptors on the human body that receive different kinds of information and things like that. So this is a problem in perceptual information processing, and it has nothing to do with these few terms that have become popular but actually don't mean anything because they're the wrong frames of reference. So people that say these things, I'm very appreciative of the American genius that occupies a great part of these chains of command. You know, I mean, there are really some really smart people that are around. There are a lot of idiots too, but there's lots of smart people working on these things, and I mean, you know, this is an area to be investigated, but the discoveries in it are so sensitive that the general public has to become convinced that there's nothing to it.
But it's the exact opposite, isn't it? I've got a lot of faxes here saying, you know, Art, I've really always wanted to know. I'm just not 100% convinced there is even such a phenomena as remote viewing. Is there any question whatsoever in your mind but that remote viewing is an absolutely true discipline, that it's real?
Well, I mean, that could be my personal opinion, but the evidence is that the SRI program was funded for 20 years, well, actually 18 years. And if there was no reality here, then that funding would have stopped the second year, right?
One would certainly think so, yes.
Oh, no, one has to know that. I mean, people don't run around and pour money into something that doesn't work. I mean, that's
are you making
our whole system.
No, wait a minute. Are you making that statement about our government?
Anybody.
That they don't pour money into things that don't work?
Right. If they know it doesn't work, then they don't pour money into it.
Well, I don't know about that, Ingo.
Well, I mean, things. You know, I know you pour millions of dollars into developing toilet seats and hammers and things like that.
That's right, they do.
But I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about in 1973, you could lose your job and your status if you evinced a professional interest in ESP or psychokinesis, right?
Oh, sure.
It's not the same today, but back then that was it. And in fact, the greatest worry of the executives that took the decision to support our program was how they could cover their asses against this accusation of dealing in irrationality. So we had to produce the evidence that it worked right from the start. And it was only that evidence that can explain the long investment of the various agencies that kicked in money for it.
What do you think explains the sudden Nightline program and the revelation of the whole program to begin with? In other words, was this about to leak out anyway? Was there some threat that was looming that caused them to come forward and say, guess what we've been doing and now we're not doing it? What brought that on?
The CIA has only volunteered to go public on something 3 times in their history. And the discrediting of remote viewing was one time, and it was completely unexpected at that time.
Yeah, but they do everything for a reason.
Yes, but you have really to look into what those reasons might be, you know. And in my mind, anyway, one of those reasons was that they didn't want to ever have remote viewing connected with anything extraterrestrial, because you put those two things together and you have a developing situation that these chains of command don't exactly know how to manage from the get-go, okay? So apparently the situation had gotten to a point where there were so many freedom of information inquiries and things like that those people took the extraordinary step of disclaiming it.
Are you telling me then that at some point in the program, and maybe you'd like to tell me at what point in the program, the people involved became aware of more than just terrestrial information?
Well, actually, I think it was Pat Price. You've heard of him, haven't you?
I've heard the name.
Yes, he was one of the early people that worked with Hal and sometimes with me. I think it was him who first enunciated the location of I put it a human extraterrestrial cooperation base, something like that. And
oh my, really?
Oh my, yes. And can you imagine the bells that started going off?
Oh, absolutely. A human extraterrestrial cooperation base.
Yes.
The location thereof.
Mm-hmm. I told Pat Price, I said, gosh, I don't think you should tell anybody about this. But,
do you know where I live?
But Pat Price was, yes, I know where you live.
You know where I live?
Was stubborn too, and he went ahead and talked about those things, even unofficially, And he had a good reputation, He was a police officer, and
would I regard that location as a neighbor?
No.
No. Is the location you're talking about still a classified matter?
It's been, well, I mean, it never even got to the point where it needed to be classified. I mean, you can just wipe this away without even classifying it. That place is not there anymore. That I know.
Not there anymore?
No.
Are there other places that are there now?
Oh, yes. I mean, I've just finished reading 2 books. One of them is the Soul Catcher. Oh, The Catchers of Heaven.
Yes.
By one Michael Wolff, who's talking about them like mad in his book. And
Ingo, hold it right there. We're at a break point. All right, back down to Ingo Swann after that last little bombshell. I would like to ask Ingo just exactly how much do you know about human extraterrestrial intercourse, intellectual or otherwise?
Well, 50% of what I know is I put in my book, Penetration. The question of extraterrestrial and human telepathy.
That's right. It's called penetration, isn't it?
Penetration. That's what secrecy's all about, man. Keep it from being penetrated.
This is your latest book?
No, I had written a number of books which no publisher would touch with a 10-foot pole. So eventually, I decided to publish them myself,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the things that I've experienced and learned, I should put them in print somewhere, so.
And your latest book, is it self-published as well?
Yes, Penetration is self-published. And then I went ahead and did the Psychic Sexuality book, too, because this is another, it's very hard for you to think that anything can be covered up about sexuality.
I know.
But indeed it can. And it was a good way to show how the entire field of energetics is covered up, too. So I published that one, too.
All right. Then give us just a sort of a 101 on human ET contact. Is it extensive? Has it been going on a long time? Are there a lot of bases? People have a lot of questions about this, Ingo.
Yes, I know they do. The only thing I can do is, many years ago when I was working at the United Nations, I came across a book called Spacemen in the Ancient East. And I wrote to the author, who's, I'm sure, deceased by now, and carried on a correspondence with him, and he had tracked the historical story of ETs coming to Earth, and then he wrote a book called Ancient Astronauts in the West, Ancient Astronauts in Israel, and it just went on and on and on, and I said, good heavens, And the thing about this book is that this guy learned 9 languages in order to read original texts and things like that, and he gave the references. So I checked out some of the references, and they were there. So this is a well-researched document. He couldn't get his books published in the United States. He got to be quite famous in England and in Europe, and especially in Italy for some reason. But there was one version of Spacemen in the Ancient East published here in the United States, and then after that, no publisher would take his books on, and he wrote about 10 of them. Mm-hmm. So, I said, well, why is it that these books won't get published in America? Mm-hmm. And at the bottom line, they're just too revealing, right? I mean, they say the right things. They do the right history. They document it and everything like that. So I said, well, there's some kind of cover-up going on here, I mean, powerful people do have control of book publishers. And so that started me off in the 60s on this kind of interest, and that was before I started doing experiments in laboratories on ESP and PK and things like that.
First-hand knowledge in this area, Ingo?
Yes, I do. It's really strange.
That's okay. This is the home of strange.
This is the home of strange.
Yeah.
Well, in 1975, I found myself invited into a very strange remote viewing thing, and that's the whole story of that is the first part of my book, Penetration. And it turned out that, this was really, really strange, the way it went about and things. But it turned out that the guy involved was very obviously part of a larger system having deep concern in extraterrestrial matters. He wanted me to remote view certain locations on the moon, of all things. Mm-hmm. So I did that. And then he kept asking, while we were doing this, it took about 3 days in an underground installation somewhere. It took about 3 days, and he kept introducing the topic of telepathy as an by the way type of thing. And so finally, I can be really naive and sometimes, and it took me about 48 hours to say, this guy's not interested in remote viewing. He already knows what's on the moon. He's interested in the telepathic thing, And so I said, come on, you guys have a problem, a telepathic problem with ETs, don't you? And, of course, that blew the cool of everybody. And I had promised not to talk about this for 10 years.
For 10 years?
There was no paper trail of this project and anything. But what had happened was I briefly got on the inside of this super-duper secret thing of dealing with ETs. And it turns out I didn't play my cards right. If I had played my cards better, I could have probably been taken into the whole thing and become a lifetime project,
What is on the moon, Ingo?
Stuff. And them.
And them. Their stuff.
It's not our stuff.
Well, there has been, when you think about the U.S. space program,
yes,
the manned space program particularly, over 30 years ago we went to the moon, and we've never gone back.
That's right.
Nor have we gone anywhere else with men.
That's right.
And a lot of people have been really curious about that, and I know they talk about money and they talk about a lot of other things. And I've interviewed a lot of astronauts, Ingo, and when you ask them about their time on the moon, walking on the moon, they give you really strange answers. Like, they'll say, well, it's funny, but when I think about it, the entire experience was surreal. And we've asked specific questions about, like, did you see this or did you see that? And there's sort of a stutter-step hesitation, and they'll say, no, but it could have been there, and I could have not seen it. I was in such
really? Did they go that far?
Yeah. Yes.
I've never heard anyone go that far.
Yes, I have.
Well, you're on the pulse of things, and I'm not.
even people like Neil Armstrong, you know, the first guy to set foot on, has made some very intriguing statements with regard to what could be ahead of us, the fantastic things that could be ahead of us, and I don't think he's talking about the International Space Station. He actually did that at the White House. So, and then, of course, we have the fact that all of these astronauts, or the great majority of them actually, have come to real problems, psychological, drinking, domestic problems, all kinds of problems that one might imagine could be precipitated by trying to hold on to information that they don't really want to hold on to. Speculation, but not bad.
Well, I think that they're in a place that is really difficult. You know, let's say if there's stuff on the moon that isn't ours, then there is a real problem. And I think that the best way to handle that problem is just to put out a public type of program that says nothing at all about anything.
Well, they've done that.
Yeah, they've done that. No, they didn't go back to the moon after a certain point. In fact, they left 3 fully developed manned landing things on the pads and never used them. They were set to go, and they never used the last 3 of them. Did you know that?
I did not know that specifically. No, I didn't.
Well, it's in my book. Everything is in my book.
In other words,
I shouldn't say everything, but things like that are in my book. You know, I mean,
all right,
when you put the pieces together, you come up with a story, right?
That's right.
Okay. So the way to not come up with a story is to prevent the pieces from being put together.
I love reading between the lines, and boy, you sure have lots of good reading between those lines for us. To get your book, or any of your book, by the way, what would you recommend as a first book for people to read? What would you like to have them read right now?
Well, I only have 2 available, and I think they should read both of them because actually they're on totally different topics, but they're interrelated. The first one's called Penetration, the Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy. And the second one is called Psychic Sexuality, the Biopsychic Anatomy of Sexual Energies.
Ingo, I've interviewed a lot of people about apparitions and ghosts and things that are inexplicable. And in almost every case, it seems that these apparitions, psychokinetic occurrences, inexplicable occurrences of all sorts, seem to occur around young teenage girls.
But that's not true.
Well, according to some people, it is. And
I know. I mean, Freud and Jung noticed that this in the presence of teenage girls, and
are you hearing that, Ingo?
Yes, they're back.
Unbelievable.
So, I mean, you know, people like to latch onto one explanation, and the one explanation was you had to have a prepubescent teenage girl to have these kind of effects, but that's not true. People of all ages experience them. Well,
I suppose that may be true, but you don't suppose the extra raging hormones in a young teenage girl would specifically engender that energy any more than...
Well, it could be, but actually it happens with boys, too. I mean, so some of these prepubescent boys...
I remember.
I mean, come on. We can't locate it to just this one thing, actually. But actually, if you have disturbed sexual energies, these are very powerful energies, you know, and they could kick anything off. And it's just that I sort of resist limiting it to what is just hearsay, In fact, if you talk with Dr. William Roll, who specializes in this kind of thing, apparitions and PK combined and things, you'd get a better background as to how it's distributed. The thing is that people who are more mature probably don't report this as much. It doesn't become they're afraid to report it because they're going to be thought of as crazy.
I know.
But parents who have a disturbed daughter or a teenager would likely take them to a shrink and say, fix this. And that's why it's more visible there.
So sexual energy then is immediately transferable in a psychic manner, or can be detected very easily psychically, or...
Well, haven't you ever detected somebody's vibes, sex vibes?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. This is the point I make. Here's the tip of an iceberg about psychoenergetics, If there's one thing that can't be accounted for in materialistic terms, and that same thing can be picked up by just about everybody, it's sexual energies. And this is the one common thing that most people share in common, but it's never been researched. In fact, researchers who've embarked upon it have usually been burnt at the stake, so to speak.
Well, wouldn't most medical doctors say it's something that's given off, what do they call them? Hormones?
Pheromones.
Pheromones, thank you.
Well, for many years, the conventional scientific establishment denied the existence of human pheromones.
That's true.
That's true. And it's only right now that I'm beginning to see articles. I subscribe to science periodicals and things. Now it seems okay to think that humans do have pheromones, especially in the armpits. The armpits produce these things.
Really?
So if you sniff armpits, you can sniff pheromones. And I have a Science News here that says this, And you have to, what you read is not the truth usually. And so you have to have a big input from a number of different sources to get a bigger picture of these things, But yes, but pheromones essentially can be smelled by the nose. In fact, there's a series of receptors that have been discovered in the nose, and I happen to have this list of recently discovered receptors, and at the top of it is receptors in the nose, sensing systems that smell emotions, and that can identify motives, sexual receptivity, antagonism, and benevolence.
Well, how do we delineate, though, between the attraction caused by armpits and the brain?
I don't know. I don't know everything. But the fact is that the nose does more than smell smells. It smells emotions. And
fear.
And fear, yeah. And these were all called forms of ESP before. But in fact, there are physical receptors in the nose that do this. So you have to depart from what was thought in the past and find out what's being discovered in the now.
All right, you good for one more hour?
I guess so.
Oh, good. All right, then take a break.
You are you?
I'm always good for another hour.
Okay.
Stay right where you are. Back now to our guest, Ingo Swann. Ingo, one of the great interests in my life has been the concept, the idea of time travel. And I have been told by many, if not all, the remote viewers that remote viewing, the present, is only one of the things you can do. That, in effect, time travel or viewing into the future or into the past is equally possible. Would you agree with that?
Hypothetically, yes, but there's evidence for that. And in fact, do you mind if I review some experiments at SRI?
Not at all. Go right ahead.
One of the persons that was being a subject out there was Hella Hammond, who is a really wonderful lady. And she was doing, this was back in the early days when the Puthoff and Targ were doing outbound experiments that were called outbound remote viewing experiments. And this was, they would get 6 sealed envelopes, and they'd have to drive 2 miles from SRI and then use their calculator to randomly select one of these targets and open the envelope and go to that place. And the subject back at SRI at a given time was supposed to describe the place they were at, right?
Right.
Did you follow that?
Sure.
So I had done a series of those and got tired of doing them, and so they got Hella Hammond and a couple other people to try this. And Hella was very good at this. You know, she was really terrific, but she was also a stubborn person. And one day they came in, and she was, I know she told me that she didn't want to do the experiment because she had an appointment having to do with getting a show of her photography at Stanford University. So I says, well, I don't know what to do about it. It's up to you. So I left them alone, and pretty soon Puthoff and Targ came running into my office and said, Hella says she already knows what the site's going to be. What are we supposed to do? And I says, well, have her tell you what the site is, you know. So Hella did that, and then took off for her appointment. So then Puthoff and Targ had to go get in their car, and they drove 2 miles, and then they opened up the envelope and went to the site. And it was the matching of Hella's description and her drawing with the site was simply uncontrovertible. So she had viewed some site that had not yet been selected as a site.
Well, that's
and this is where we got the idea that remote viewing experiments could be front-timed to go somewhere in the near future, or back-timed to go into the past.
Well, no, wait a minute. There's one other possibility, of course, and that is that it was telepathy.
No. I mean, you could say that, but Puthoff and Targ didn't know what was in these 6 envelopes at all. These were generated by actually Dr. Bart Koch's office, who was the head of the physics department at that time. And they were put in sealed envelopes, and I think that there was like 100 of them altogether. And when 6 of them were needed, his secretary went and just pulled out 6 randomly.
Randomly, oh my, really?
And then gave them to Puthoff and Targ, and then they had to go 2 miles in order to open one. So, I mean, the telepathy thing explanation doesn't get very far. And
that would be Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, right?
Yes,
okay.
It would be, yes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, there's always been evidence. I mean, this is what intuitives do. They see the future, right? I mean, they see something in the future. And so here was Hella Hammond had just seen something that was a future thing that was really quite unexplainable, except by hypothesizing that the human mind or something in the human system has the ability of knowing what's going to happen in the future.
What then does that say to us, if anything, do you suppose, or would you speculate about the nature of time itself?
I don't know that. Time as we conceive it is a very arbitrary thing. It's very difficult to integrate time into this. I'm stupid about these matters anyway. But in terms of knowing that our human systems must be able to predict something of what's going to happen to them in the future, actually has to be there, because they couldn't survive very well if there wasn't there. So it's just like smelling pheromones in the armpit. You can smell the future coming or something like that, And time doesn't seem to matter, because time is just a series of numbers that are arbitrary.
Except the implication of all this is that if you can be aware of what will occur in the future, reliably so even,
yes,
then we are but marionettes acting out the preordained.
Oh, no, we're much more than that. We are extraordinary sensing systems whose sensing potentials and capabilities are not confined to the present. We can sense things in the past and in the future. And we are sensing systems. And any life form that's going to have very much going for survival has to be able to sense beyond the present. And you've got to understand that what we call the present, the now, although it seems really big to us, is but a flickering moment between the past and the future.
You bet.
That's all it is. And so you have to think of time streams. You don't need to think in terms of past, present, and future. That something is streaming, and we're part of that streaming. And so, I mean, we have to know certain things. I mean, even in materialistic sense, you know, we have to understand what's happening physically and project from that what's going to happen physically.
Then
there's no reason that the mind can't do this too.
Then could it be changed? In other words, could you view a future event and then change that event by your action?
I think so. I've managed to actually do that about 3 times in my life.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Involving what?
Well, some people were going to do things that I didn't think should be done, and I had no way of stopping them except to will it. And in fact, it did not get done. Except
to will it?
Yes.
Oh, my God. Well, now we're back to the remote influencing.
That's right. You see, you can't think of these things as separate things, like in parapsychology, clairvoyance, telepathy, PK, retrocognition.
They're not separate.
So forth. They're not separate. Mm-hmm. They're all part of us as super-duper sensing systems.
How do you feel about the ethical questions that are obviously hanging all around this?
Ethical and moral is relative to what people are thinking are ethical and moral, right?
Yes.
And if you're a fine, upstanding human sensing system, you would probably like to manage this in beneficent and procreative ways. Mm-hmm. If you happen to be a scumbag, then you might manage them differently, right? So this is all relative, you know, and what's relative cannot really be brought into the picture until you understand what these relativities are being relative to.
Well, if you're not an ethical person, you might you might precipitate procreation, but it would be a sidebar.
Well, you mean a random download?
Well, I mean a random seduction, I guess.
Yeah, I know. We don't know enough about ourselves. I mean, the image of the human that has been set forth in the past is really an extremely limited one. And I think that it's been supported socially and propagated through social conditioning to prevent people from becoming more powerful than they are. Actually. Power belongs to the few, and the few like that, and they don't want the rest to get powerful. So you set up a simple idea that is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't incorporate larger truths. So then this is what you teach people, you know, that the human being is a body, a physical body only. Well, it's not. Even the atoms are made of energy, and you get into the realm of psychoenergetics, energetics right away, and if you get into that realm, then everything else begins to unfold, telepathy, cognition, everything. We're sensing systems.
I am told, Ingo, that as carefully as the protocols were structured in the military program, that other things began to creep in.
Sure.
That other things began to be sensed, entities.
Right.
That is right.
Of course. Once you activate, let's say that when you go into a training program, let's say we have a full spectrum, a 100% spectrum of sensing faculties, okay?
Yes.
And in the normal case, 10% of them have been activated, and the other 90% have been barriered or kept unactivated. Mm-hmm. So you go into a consciousness, awareness, perceptual training system that is the essential goal of which is to enhance perception and awareness, okay?
Okay.
So you start doing that, and then above this initial 10%, other sensing systems begin to become activated, okay? So the more these get activated, the more you start sensing everything. You're not just confined to the initial 10%. So yes, there are beings around, there's telepathy, there's this and that and so forth and so on. So you activate. The thing that has been done is you've expanded awareness by these training programs, and to the degree that you've expanded awareness in this or that direction, you'll begin to sense other things besides what you're supposed to. And
I bet the military hated that.
Yes. Well, everybody hated it, you know. I mean, this just takes down all the walls and barriers, you know. And so the only defense against this from happening is for the powerful few, the power structures, and so forth and so on, is to discredit 90% of our sensing systems.
The only problem with that is that they know that people like you are still out there.
They know about these sensing systems. That's what they know about. And I'm just a jiggle in the system here, you know. And it doesn't matter. I mean, you know, a person can be contained, but if the general public began aware that they're using only 10% of their sensing systems and then made noises about wanting to have more of these activated, then this becomes a real societal problem. And so in the modern West, you know, there's been a great deal of effort to say, no, you only have 5 physical senses you don't have anymore. And so the make-break point is between whether you accept that or you don't accept it. If you don't accept it, then these other sensing systems are likely to turn on in a random way.
Well, I know, but still, the knowledge of the powerful that there are people like you out there would be unacceptable unless you had come to some accommodation with them.
Well, I mean, if they can harness you to use for their purposes, then I guess you'd be dragged into the inside. But you see, I'm too really stubborn for that.
Well, that's what I mean. You're not harnessed now, so...
In terms of other people, there was a very famous psychic, I guess we should call him that, in Poland at the turn of the century, named Osowiecki. And he just outdid me in every direction, you know. And when the Germans at that time became aware of him, and they said, you have to come and work with us, that he wouldn't do it. And so he didn't have too much more time to spend among us. So, I mean, there's historical precedent for what I'm saying. I'm not just saying...
You're saying he was killed?
I think it. I can show in the past, even going back to some really big, ugly societal sequences, that power, if power is to be held in the hands of the few, then the rest must be somehow depowered. And the way to do that is to confine their perceptual systems to smaller orders.
But they're never really going to harness people like you, because people like you are going to refuse to be harnessed. You're in a different realm. It's not just Ingo. It's a lot of other people like Ingo, or with some portion of Ingo's abilities. Well, once those abilities are acquired, the rebellion is almost a foregone conclusion, isn't it?
Yes, they know that too. I mean, this is not new. I mean, inside power structures, this is not new. This has been a problem since Greek times. You know, I mean, the prophetesses survived as long as they worked for the state. Okay.
Yeah.
If they did not work for the state, then they were
eliminated.
So there's a historical stream of this that goes on through.
In modern times, you come to some sort of accommodation with them. You're still here. I must presume either we are sophisticated beyond what I thought we were, or you have come to some accommodation with them.
No. In intelligence services, there's a standard rule of thumb that you don't actually need to interact with people producing information, because you can acquire the information anyway, okay?
Well, sure.
Okay. I mean, in the case of Puthoff and myself, this was an urgency due to the psychoenergetic threat from the Soviet Union at the time. But actually, for instance, in the Internet, everybody can put in anything they want now, right?
Correct.
And if there was a system of control, if to prevent that was more ideal than permitting it, then they wouldn't be allowed to do that, right? So the listeners, people spill their guts in the Internet, and so these intelligence services just sit back and let them spill their guts. So in my case, I've been told that I'm free to do what I want because they'll find out about it anyway, and they can use it. Maybe it's useful.
Well, yeah,
it's
maybe.
when you become a threat that they become concerned, and I'm not a threat to them because everything I've talked about already tonight is already more or less in the public domain anyway.
Well, that's a kind of accommodation, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Ingo, hold on. We're at the bottom of the hour. We'll be right back. Ingo Swan is my guest. Ingo, you specified when we talked before the show that you didn't want to talk about any other remote viewers specifically, and I respect that, and I understand that. But I do want to ask this. There is an incredible amount of dissension, backbiting, angst, difficulty between many of the remote viewers. What do you attribute that to?
Well, it's an extension of what goes on in parapsychology itself. If you think there's dissension somewhere, you should get into the middle of parapsychology. And I've discussed this with Dr. Charles Tart, for instance, who is a well-known parapsychologist and everything. I mean, why is there this dissension?
Yes.
And he admitted he didn't know. But, parapsychology does not enjoy full scientific acceptance, so there are no boards or committees that are established to sort of keep this dissension under manageable control. And there's certainly nothing like that in the open field of remote viewing either. So you have people doing what they do, trying to claim territory and things like that. My position is, in terms of the general public, that any remote viewing is better than none at all, because even bad remote viewing you learn something from. And I think that if remote viewing is going to be of interest to the general public, then the general public has to deal with it. I don't have to deal with it anymore. I'm retired, okay?
Yes.
And I respect anybody who undertakes to make sense out of remote viewing and all of these other things. I think probably some of them have limited frames of reference and don't build a bigger picture of things, but that's irrelevant in a way, because people have to deal with something themselves in order to gain realities about it. It's that simple. For instance, you can't read any book and think you've gained any reality. What you've gained is maybe a bigger frame of reference to consider matters under. So it's hands-on, and those people that took remote viewing into the open field, I think it was a very brave thing of them to do, but they have to deal with it, not me. Something like that.
Okay. During the military remote viewing program, were there any people who lost it, who could not handle what they were trying to do or the information they were receiving? It's another way of asking, I suppose, whether for some individuals it would be dangerous.
I personally don't know anything of that kind. In fact, the military part of this only started in about 1980, and so there was 10 years preceding that, okay?
Right.
When this was all being developed. And we called for volunteers at SRI to do remote viewing experiments. We got 200 volunteers, and all of them were extremely enthusiastic, and the enthusiasm, you see, One of the reasons why I don't think I should be called the grandfather of remote viewing, I don't like the idea of being a grandfather anyway, it's forgotten that in order to make remote viewing something that amounted to something, this involved over 500 people. And most of them just devoted their guts and blood to making these issues real. And if you say, I'm the grandfather of remote viewing, or Hal Puthoff is, he deserves the title, I don't. But if you say either one of us are, then you're obliterating the efforts of these other 500 people. And I don't think that's fair, because they worked their guts out, and they resisted the bad press, they resisted the bad publicity, they resisted getting fired because they were involved, and so forth and so on. And our experience at SRI was consistently that anybody who got involved in it was really enthusiastic and had no problems at all in handling what they got engaged in. The problem came before, when people were afraid that their minds were somehow going to be altered.
Sure.
And if this was a strong point, they weren't accepted as a candidate for experiments. Because, I mean, you don't need to deal with that, when you have enthusiastic people who say, I'll do anything to learn more about myself, for instance. Other things that were, other programs elsewhere that were invasive and forced things in and so forth and so on, I think there were some bad reactions. But this cannot be said of the SRI program. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not.
Andrew in Phoenix asks the following of you. What was the scariest, strangest remote viewing session or incident you ever participated in?
Oh, Puthoff and I had to agree to do what were called operational targets.
Yes. For
the funding parties, and we did hundreds of them, And the most awful one had to do with a target in what was then East Germany, and they couldn't tell what was going on from the surface, from photos and things, flyover satellites.
Sure.
And things. So it was assigned. I didn't know it was just assigned by coordinate, and underground, on top it would seem like a prison, but underground it was a biological experimental station of all these terrible diseases and drugs and everything.
Human biological experiment?
Oh, yes. It was just dreadful. And I can almost start weeping again. I ended up, this is just so horrible that finally I just broke into tears. And this was terrible. Terrible.
In remote viewing something like that, how much transference of the pain and the horror? Apparently there's a lot.
It can be almost complete. Early in my career, I worked with the New York Police Department to help find solve crimes.
Yes.
And when you came across victims that had their throats slit and their hands cut off and things like this, remember, you can view it, if you can remain objective for these things, you can sort of detach, but if you start experiencing what the victims went through, then your whole system thinks that's what's happening to you. And so after 2 years, I said, hey, guys, I can't do this anymore. You have to use these. At that time, there were 3 female psychics in New Jersey who could tolerate this. And I said, you have to use them. I can't do this anymore. I'm not built that way.
Huh.
And even though I had a background in biology, I used to draw autopsies at the Salt Lake City General Hospital while they were being done and things. But there you remained objective. You didn't sense the sensations and so forth and so on. So, no, this East German thing was just awful, because actually it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that, and the extent of it, and the smells in these underground chambers were not to be believed.
All of that came through.
All of that came through. It was just terrible.
Ingo, I'm looking at my own website right now, and I know you say you've only got 2 books, but Penetration is the first one listed, Penetration, the Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy. Mm-hmm. But it's followed by The Great Apparitions of Mary,
Yes, that's still in print, but I didn't publish that myself.
An examination of the 22 supernatural appearances.
That's still in print, and in my website, where that can be ordered from is in my website.
Also Amazon.com, by the way.
Oh, is it?
Oh, yes.
Oh, great.
You didn't know that?
Well, actually, my royalty statements don't reflect that.
Well, they will soon, as well as Purple Fables Quartet.
Yes, that's still in print.
On Amazon. Opening to the Infinite. Human Multidimensional Potential.
Are you talking about your Nostradamus factor?
I'm talking about a book called Opening to the Infinite. Human Multidimensional Potential. Now,
that's not mine.
That's not yours, huh?
No.
Well, then I don't know how we got that up there. You're right. Well, now, wait a minute. You did, I see how it got up there. You did the introduction to that book.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Oh, that's Alice, what's her name's book?
Yes,
my
that's
dear
right.
friend.
That's right.
Yes, she passed away.
I see. So that's how it got up there. All right, well.
I did the introduction to that.
I'm very interested in the apparitions of Mary. What work did you do on that, and what can you tell us about that?
Well, early on at SRI, part of our mandate was to assess this whole general field of everything, and I said, well, the apparitions of Mary are paranormal. We were supposed to assess the paranormal, okay? And the client wasn't interested in that, but I got interested in it, and I started accumulating information about these things. And these are tremendous stories. And actually, it took a long time to sell that book or this version of it because publishers said, well, nobody's really interested in those things. But these are tremendous stories. So I wrote it from the societal historical point of view and just sort of reported what I could find went on at these times. And these are some of these are really amazing events. So that's what that book's about.
Were they real events?
Oh, yes.
Were they real events as perceived by the world of Marian apparitions? Were they?
I have to accept that as so, yes.
You do?
Yes.
That brings a lot with it.
Yes, it do indeed.
Have you ever done targets like, for example, the man Jesus, the Son of God,
nope.
So said, that walked upon earth?
No. I don't do targets where there's no feedback potential. I never did one that didn't have a feedback potential. If you don't have feedback, then you don't know what you have. Anybody can say anything. So I have always had, right from the first, by the way, in 1970 when I started, I had to decide to do only experiments where there was almost immediate feedback as to whether you were right or wrong or what's going on, okay?
Right.
And I maintained that attitude up until I retired. So if there was no feedback potential, then I did not do it. And this isn't to say that it can't be done, because I think it can. But
right.
Remember, I worked with scientists. I never worked with anybody else but a scientist. I never gave any demonstrations to anybody.
And scientists, of course, are only interested in what can be repeated and proven.
Right. So I rigorously held to that until I retired.
You said until you retired. Do you continue to do work, and have you expanded the work you do since your retirement? Personally.
Well, yes and no. I've felt interested in going behind the scenes of all these things and pointing up information that's not generally available, since it's not really recognized as existing. The invisible. If you're talking about the concrete world of physicality, you can probably get a handle on everything. But if you're talking about the realms of the mind, you're talking about invisible realms, which have their own phenomena, and these are not clearly presented anywhere. So I'm writing up what I've learned, and along these lines. And when I'm done writing up with what I've learned, I really tend to retire. I'm going to get rid of all my archives and books, and I'm going to go watch the grass grow.
Are you
or
really?
I'll come out where you are and watch the sand move around.
Yeah,
you know, I was born in Telluride, Colorado, so I appreciate natural beauty really much. And
a lot of people look at the desert and they go, oh, my God, a wasteland, but it's not.
The desert's fabulous.
Yes.
Every once in a while I make a tour through the Southwest just to look at the deserts.
It'd be a good time. We're within a few days now of what I think is going to be about 1,000-year bloom here in the desert because of the amount of moisture.
Yeah.
And I'm about 20 miles from Death Valley.
Uh-huh.
And it's going to be quite a year this year.
It's going to be gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I probably won't make it, but I'm too busy finishing my next book.
Which is?
Oh, I'm not even going to say.
Oh, how about the general topic? Can you talk about that?
Power.
Power. Power.
Yes. What do you think all this is about?
I always thought it was about power.
Everything you and I have discussed tonight
is power.
Is about power. Yes.
That's why I don't know how they can leave you alone.
Well, they're not knocking down my doors. Every once in a while, I get lots of visitors from all over the world, you know, and they come to check me out and things and ask me questions, and I answer them to the best of my ability. So that's not exactly leaving me alone, you know. As you can think that I'm a threat and a danger, but also I'm a resource. I mean, you know, I've aligned all this data and gathered it and so forth.
Well, let's think about this. Take our president, for example, President Clinton.
Oh, dear. I don't talk about individuals.
Well, a generic president. All right, let's talk about a generic president. A generic president has an idea of a social change he wants to make, and he's going to make this by executive order.
Yes.
Can this president, this generic president, be certain that this idea, this inspiration, was his own? Now we're talking about power.
Yes, I know. Well, if we're talking about generic presidents, it's my impression that they work for the real powers that rule the world.
That's what I've heard, too.
Yes. And, in fact, you know, that's been stated, you know. Mr. Ford earlier on gave money to both parties so he could control whichever one candidate won. He said that in his books, you know. And so this has been going on since year one, I guess, you know. I mean, if you want to have power with somebody, you contribute to them, and then whoever wins, they're still in your pocket type of thing.
But whoever controls this generic president or all generic presidents, they, too, would be perhaps subject to influence.
Well, power is defined as control, authority, and influence over others.
Yes.
And so this is a chain of command, right?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you can track it up to the top, and you can see these generic presidents are playing a part in a chain of command, you know. So it actually goes up higher and higher and higher. People who write about the power elites probably have their points, you know. I mean,
have you done a lot of things that you would not and could not talk about?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you might have. Listen, what an interview this has been. I have, in my program, I have 1 hour left, and I can always open the lines and allow people to ask questions, or I can allow you to go to bed and get a little sleep because it's like about 5 o'clock in the morning back there.
Yes, it is.
And so what I do is I leave it up to my guests always at this time to bail out and get a little bit of sleep and start their day or whatever, or stay for one last hour. It's all up to you.
Could we have another interview sometime?
You bet we could.
Okay, let's do that.
All right. Then, Ingo,
I have an appointment at 10:30 this morning.
Believe me, I understand. The world does not live as I do. Ingo, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. You're a wonderful, wonderful